A very warm welcome to the new episode of Ink and Insight in the process of inviting global thought leaders from around the world. Today, I'm extremely delighted to invite one of the very prominent philosopher and intellectual historian of our time, Peter Adamson, Professor Peter Adamson himself. Professor Peter Adamson holds two academic positions, Professor of Philosophy in Late Antiquity and in the Islamic World at the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. And he is also a Professor of Ancient and Medieval Philosophy at King's College London. Peter Adamson hosts a globally popular weekly podcast, which is titled History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. The podcast has surpassed 25 million downloads in 2019, and it attempts to make philosophy accessible to all people from across the culture. It has covered some Greek philosophy, Islamic philosophy, European philosophy, and also have launched a series of dialogue on Indian and Chinese philosophy. Next to other academic publication, Adamson has turned the podcast into a book series as well. So his latest book is Don't Think for Yourself, Authority and Belief in Medieval Philosophy, which was released in 2022. Professor Adamson is also invited across the very reputed global platforms to speak on these issues. He's been giving talks on Google Talks, the Australian National Radio, and the BBC Radio 4. It is such a pleasure to have him in my show. Thank you so much for your time, Peter.
Thanks for having me on.
Peter, the objective of this program is really not to delve too much into the philosophy of any reason, as we have half an hour slot, but to really understand how philosophy is useful in modern times. So let me begin by asking: are philosophers really different from individuals from other professions, Peter?
That's a funny question. I mean, in my experience, philosophers do tend to be eccentric, especially when I think maybe they've gotten less eccentric while I've been in the field. Maybe it's become a little bit more professionalized, but you can definitely meet some pretty odd people who do philosophy, professionally at least. Maybe sort of like mathematicians have a reputation for being odd, which in my experience is not unjustified. But on the other hand, I think we shouldn't fall into the trap of thinking that only professional philosophers do philosophy. I think everybody thinks about philosophical problems to some extent, maybe not all day, every day like we do, but you can't really get through life without thinking about philosophy occasionally.
So how is philosophy really useful in day-to-day lives, Peter?
Yeah, so that's in a way what I just meant. So I think that there's two ways of approaching that question. So one way would be to think about what everyday people or people, facing everyday life could get out of what you might call professional philosophy or the history of philosophy. And there, you might imagine, for example, difficult questions in ethics or difficult political decisions, or even questions about, whether God exists, what it even means to be a human, and so on. And I think that living in a way that draws on, as it were, more advanced reflections about those topics makes sense. Like, for example, if you're trying to decide whether God exists, it might not be a bad idea to find out about what philosophers have said about whether you can prove the existence of God. See if you're convinced by the proofs. But I do also think that if people are thoughtful about what they do and believe in their everyday life, that's helpful. So in particular, just to give an example, you mentioned this book that I published just a couple of years ago about authority and belief in medieval philosophy. And one reason I wrote that is that I think it's a kind of timely question for us, how to form belief based on what authoritative figures say. So, for example, if you're trying to decide what to believe about climate change, then unless you're actually a scientist who works on climate change, then you're not really in a position to have a well-informed opinion of your own about what climate change is, whether it's real, what should be done about it, and so on. So you're kind of relying on the expertise of other people. You're, as it were, outsourcing your beliefs to those people. And doing that in a responsible way is important for being a good citizen and, in some ways, a good person.
Right. So how does philosophy helps us to bridge the gaps between the cultures? I mean, you have been doing a podcast on philosophies of different reasons, so you are experienced enough to tell us how is it helpful in terms of bridging the cultural gaps, Peter?
Yeah, so that's a question that I guess gets more towards my own particular interests and expertise. I mean, actually, often philosophy is studied in a way that's culturally very narrow. So it's still quite common, at least in Europe and the United States, North America. Still quite common to study philosophy as if it were basically a European phenomenon. So it starts with Plato and Aristotle, and it marches on through later ancient philosophy, medieval philosophy, early modern philosophy. So we're basically going from Plato and Aristotle to Aquinas, Descartes, Kant, Hegel, right? So that's what philosophy would be. It sort of ends with Wittgenstein analytic philosophy and what's going on now. And of course, that's all very interesting. And it's also stuff I'm trying to cover in my podcast and book series. But I've always been very interested in the philosophy of other cultures. So in my case, especially philosophy in the Islamic world, because that's my main research area, or one of them. And I've also, as you said, I've covered Indian philosophy and Africana philosophy in the podcast. We're just about to start covering Chinese philosophy. And I think that one of the things that history of philosophy can actually do for us is to show us, first of all, that philosophy is not a kind of purely European phenomenon, but that it's appeared all over the world. Maybe it's even appeared wherever there have ever been humans. But certainly it's appeared in Africa and China and India, all the cultures that I've been covering. And I think, first of all, it's interesting to compare and contrast philosophy that happens in these other cultures and civilizations to what's happened in Europe. There are maybe two options of how that could look. One would be that you find some of the same ideas and moves and arguments being made independently in, for example, ancient Greece and ancient India. So, for example, there's atomism in both ancient Greece and ancient India. In other words, there's the view that bodies are made of indivisible smallest parts. And then there's a kind of theory about how they would come together to form larger bodies. So that exists in both of these ancient cultures, apparently independently, although people sometimes wonder whether there might be historical links. And you might think, well, that's actually very encouraging. Like if the same ideas are being discovered or invented independently in more than one culture, then you might think, well, there's something to it. Like there's here an exploration of the possible philosophical positions one could take. Sort of like if two independent mathematicians discovered the same thing, then it encourages you to think that they're both getting hold of some objective truth. And that's one option. Another option, which actually in a way I find more exciting, is that you find philosophy in other cultures that doesn't look like it's the same as what happens in Europe, or maybe is giving different answers to questions that also arise in the European tradition. So things that are distinctive to Indian philosophy or Chinese philosophy, African philosophy, and so on. And I think actually there's a kind of an interplay between those two things that we've pursued in all of these series on non-Western philosophy. So on the one hand, there's this sort of shock of recognition, like, oh, that's something that looks a lot like what Plato or Aristotle would say. So, for example, people sometimes compare the ethics of Confucius to the ethics of Aristotle. Or sometimes I'm thinking about Chinese philosophy a lot because we're just about to start covering that. So people might think that Moist philosophy in ancient China looks sort of like utilitarianism or consequentialism in European philosophy. So that's in a way encouraging, as I say. And it's also, by the way, one way to convince people who are skeptical that these other traditions were genuinely doing philosophy, because you just say, well, look, here in ancient China, I've got something that looks a lot like utilitarianism, like what Bentham and Mill were doing much, much, much later. in England, then people are going to say, oh, okay, I guess that's philosophy, because if it counts as philosophy when Mill says it, then it must count as philosophy when Mozi says it in ancient China. But on the other hand, looking at philosophy in other cultures can expand our notion of what philosophy is. It can expand our kind of wealth of different moves and arguments and ideas and answers that are given to philosophical questions or questions we can recognize as philosophical. So I think that in both ways we can see the value of these non-Western or non-European traditions.
Yeah, so either we converge in terms of ideas or philosophy, or we diverge. In both ways, it's helpful. That's what you mean to say.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So also, Peter, I was also wondering, has the philosophical concept saved the historical events over a period of time?
Yeah, actually, that's something that I've tried to emphasize a lot in the series. I think, I mean, when you talk about history of philosophy, something that people sometimes ask is, well, is that really a kind of history or is it a kind of philosophy? And the behind that question is the suggestion that if the answer is that it's a kind of history, then maybe it's something that philosophers don't ultimately need to find that interesting. So some philosophers would say history of philosophy might be kind of informative in the way that history is informative, but really all I want to know is what are the right answers to philosophical questions. And who knows whether, Aristotle or Aquinas or Mozi had the right answers to philosophical questions. What I want to use is the most powerful instruments we've got, which are like modern instruments, and just answer the questions. And so this is a conception of philosophy that makes philosophy more like the natural sciences, right? Like people in physics don't spend a lot of time thinking about history of physics. And some philosophers think that in the same way, philosophers don't need to spend a lot of time thinking about the history of philosophy. So for that reason, I'm often trying to encourage people to see history of philosophy as a kind of philosophy, as something that involves a lot of philosophical reflection. You need to get into the texts and arguments and think about them from the inside, which is a philosophical task, and so on. So I do think that history of philosophy is a kind of philosophy. So it belongs in philosophy departments. And I was already sketching some of the ways that I think it can be important for philosophers to think about philosophy in a global context. But I do also think that history of philosophy is a kind of history. And one reason to emphasize that as well is that you really need to understand what's going on in the historical context of a given philosopher or movement or the production of a certain philosophical text. You have to know what was going on around the text and the author or authors if you want to understand it. So just to give an example, something I've been covering a lot in the podcast in the last couple of years now is the impact of the Protestant Reformation on philosophy. And the more I've covered that, the more I've come to think that actually many of the things that we associate with philosophy in early modern Europe are almost a direct consequence of the Protestant Reformation, which philosophers usually would think about as a historical and religious event. They don't think about it as a philosophical event. But if you think about something like, for example, arguments in favor of freedom of belief, freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, that all goes back directly to the Protestant Reformation. Basically, I mean, this is a long story, but basically the idea here is that when Protestants of various kinds started fighting with each other and fighting with Catholics, and it led to open warfare across Europe, sort of tore society apart. Eventually, once people on all sides realized that they weren't going to be able to resolve the conflict quickly, or maybe ever, they settled on the idea that everyone should just be allowed to believe and say whatever they thought. That takes a long time to happen, but it happens because of the Reformation. So that's an example of where historical context is really important.
And at this point of time, Peter, I often ask myself, perhaps it would be right to ask you as well. Do you think you and I are free as an individual?
Yes, I do think so. But I, like a lot of contemporary philosophers and also like a lot of historical philosophers, I tend to accept a position called compatibilism. So the compatibilist is someone who thinks that you can be determined to make choices in a certain way, for example, by your upbringing and maybe even by like the physical situation, like the physics of your brain, might make it sort of inevitable that you make certain choices. But I still think that you're choosing freely when you choose. So this is kind of a complicated idea, and some people find it kind of rather counterintuitive. But the basic idea would just be that you count as having chosen freely with respect to a certain particular choice if you did what you wanted to do. So people who deny compatibilism think that it's really important that there are genuinely alternative options open to you. And they think that if you're kind of being steered towards one option by all your beliefs and desires and the state of your brain, the physical state of the world and so on, if that kind of determines which choice you make, then you're not free. But actually, I don't think that's a very interesting idea of freedom. Like, why does it? So if I really wanted to do it, then I chose it, and I don't really care if I could also have done some other thing that I didn't want to do. Right? It doesn't make me free that I could have done something else. What makes me free is that I did want to do this thing. And as I say, a lot of philosophers agree with me about that. In the European context, it goes back to the Stoics. The Stoics also had that idea about freedom.
Right. And in this present context, the time that we are living in this world right now, the very fast connected world, I mean, how much interest you think the people would have towards philosophy compared to the past right now? I mean, is there the interest is gaining momentum, or do you think it's declining? Where do we stand as a subject?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think that the one thing that's definitely changed is that is that access to knowledge about philosophy has increased massively, even in the last 20 years. So since I got my PhD, let's say, which was in 2000. So, I mean, when I was an undergraduate student, if I wanted to learn about something in the history of philosophy, I literally had to go find a book, a physical book. So if it wasn't in the library of my college, then I couldn't read it, basically. I mean, I could have like gone to a bigger city, gone to a better library or whatever. Could have maybe tried to buy a book at a bookstore, but what you could get your hands on was basically limited to what you could physically find to read. And that's only in my lifetime, right? And I mean, I'm not that old. So I grew up in the 80s. I was a student in the 90s. Whereas now, you basically have access to everything all the time, right? Which is obviously very overwhelming, and that causes its own problems. But I think that it also offers an opportunity. And of course, what you're doing here with this video series is an example. My podcast is an example, but there's hundreds and hundreds of examples. There's many podcasts on philosophy, for example. And that's made it much easier to get access to philosophy. And I mean, in my experience, a very wide range of people are interested in doing that. So it's not like most of the people who listen to my podcast are academics or students of philosophy. Most of the people who listen to my podcast are just people who are interested in it. And the only thing you really need is an internet connection, right? So wherever you are in the world, you can listen to it. And I think that's actually a very exciting development in the possibilities of spreading knowledge about this discipline.
Right. And so, the kind of disruptions that we are facing in terms of, because of the development of the technology, because of the development of the tools like AI and the other stuffs, what impact these kind of disruptions would have on philosophy itself?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, one thing that may not be obvious from the outside is that there are some areas of philosophy that could benefit quite a bit from AI. So there's some, actually here in Munich, we have a center called the Center for Mathematical Philosophy. And they actually are using mathematical formal methods to analyze various philosophical problems, even something like what we were talking about before. So like theories about decision making, for example, maybe in politics. And you could imagine AI being brought to bear on a problem like that, actually. Whether an AI could do philosophy is, of course, an interesting question. I'm not sure I really know enough about AI to answer that question. I tend to think that the kind of AI that we have now, the sort of chat GPT way of generating text, where you just what it's doing is kind of predicting the next most probable word that should fit. I don't think that that's ever going to produce philosophy. I mean, it might produce something that looks like philosophy, but since the AI doesn't actually know what it's literally it doesn't know what it's talking about, I don't really see why that would be philosophy. It's more like just creating very convincing junk that looks like something else. So I think actually, if you ever wanted to get to where AI was generating philosophy and producing new philosophical insights, except by mistake, because it might spit out something that a human philosopher finds interesting, right, sort of randomly. But I think if for an AI actually to do philosophy, they'd probably need to come up with a completely different way of making AI work than we are seeing now. But of course, that might happen.
Yeah, perhaps still a long time to go for AI to have sensitivities and emotions and sensibilities that human being have to sort of comprehend.
Yeah, but I think it's more basic than that. So at the moment, as I understand it, the AIs we have now don't have any way of understanding what they're talking about. What they're doing is using. I mean, actually, it's itself a philosophical question whether acting as if you understand what you're talking about could sort of be tantamount to or equivalent to understanding it, right? So how would we tell the difference, right? That's something that people sometimes think about in philosophy. But I tend to think that if all the AI is doing is generating plausible looking text that kind of fits a task, that's no reason to think that the AI is actually doing, is not actually writing poetry, is not actually creating literature, it's not actually doing philosophy. But again, that we're probably very early on in the state. We're at a very early stage of how these things will go, and in 30 years, who knows?
Right, right. And where does the relationship between the science and philosophy stands as of today?
The relationship between science and philosophy.
Yeah,
Well, in contemporary philosophy, there's actually a lot of conversation across disciplines between, for example, philosophy and psychology. So, actually, we have a philosopher here at the LMU named Ophelia Duroy, who is an expert in basically collaborating with psychologists, actually doing psychological experiments and thinking about them philosophically, or even designing the experiment to answer a philosophical question. And there are many, many areas in philosophy where you could imagine doing that, like theory of perception, again, theory of free will, right? You can study people's brains as they make decisions, and so on. So that's a good example. Of course, there's philosophy of physics. The physics that we have nowadays is extremely weird. I always think it's kind of funny that
true.
modern physics,
I like that word.
it's so strange, right? So it's actually a lot stranger than the physical theories that you find in like antiquity, right? Like ancient Greek physics is actually completely sensible. It's like, yeah, that could be. And then you hear the true modern physics is like, no, that doesn't sound like it could possibly be true. I don't even know what that means, right? Oh, it is true. So you have to try to understand it. And so there's actually a lot of call for philosophers to think about, what are the philosophical consequences or implications of the uncertainty principle, things like that. So actually, there's a kind of a blurry line in that philosophers are often collaborating with scientists and they know something about science. Maybe the scientists know something about philosophy, and that's very fruitful, and it kind of blurs the boundaries, the disciplinary boundaries between philosophy and science. You could also think about like the relationship between, say, philosophy and political science. That's probably not what you meant. But the social sciences, if you consider those to be sciences, again, there's a lot of interchange between political philosophy and the social sciences. I think ultimately, the way most philosophers would think about this is that if you're actually doing empirical research, that's science. Whereas if you're doing something like conceptual analysis, then that's philosophy. Now, obviously, conceptual analysis is informed by empirical knowledge, and the task of finding out more empirically, like doing experiments, for example, can be informed by conceptual analysis. So that's why you have this fruitful meshing of the two. But that's how people would usually think about the difference between them.
Right. So, I mean, lot of lines, as you have suggested, seems to have been blurred between the disciplines of different sciences. Take it for the physics; it started talking about the consciousness, which was a part of spirituality. Again, something tied up with the religion, and again, philosophy. It seems to have really come up together. The knowledge, the entire knowledge system, seems to have come up together these days, and it's getting really difficult to sort of differentiate which part falls into where.
Yeah, and in fact, I think there one thing that does also happen, and you see this sometimes with people who write books about like pop science, is that they sort of say, "Oh, well, science has clarified or answered this philosophical problem. Like we've done enough
Right.
brain science to sort of answer the question about what consciousness is. It's just for your brain to be in such and such a state." But actually, usually that's if you're a philosopher and you look at that stuff, it's usually pretty embarrassing at a philosophical level. Like there's a real tendency for them to think that answering an empirical question has thereby answered a philosophical question, whereas in fact, the two things, as I say, are informing each other. So if you're a philosopher of
Right.
mind who's thinking about the problem of consciousness, it certainly behooves you to know something about brain science and what they're doing in neuroscience, right? So clearly the mind has something to do with the brain, right? But
Yeah.
there's all kinds of different positions that people have taken on the relationship between the brain and the mind. And if a neuroscientist who's never done any serious philosophy comes along and says, "Well, I don't see why you people are so upset about this problem. Consciousness is just for the brain to be in the following state," then I think the philosophers are entitled to say that that person's being just as ridiculous as a philosopher who has a theory of consciousness but doesn't know anything about the brain, right? You really need to do both
Right.
and bring them together.
Right. So some of the other issues like is the issues related to the climate change, the socioeconomic disparities. So how should philosophy approach these kind of issues?
Yeah, I think first of all, philosophers should be modest about this kind of thing. I mean, bear in mind that the problem of climate change, at least at this point, nobody who's sensible thinks that there's any doubt about whether humans are causing climate change, and nobody who's sensible thinks that it's anything other than a huge problem. And so actually it's not quite clear what the philosopher still has to say about that. So I mean, there's a huge practical problem and a huge political problem. But I think the first thing to realize is that, you know, getting clear on your concepts is not going to help you solve that problem, right? Because there's just difficult decisions, difficult problems about convincing people to do things. I think, though, that around the edges, philosophers can find things to say. So one example would be that some philosophers nowadays are thinking a lot about the problem of having some kind of moral or political responsibility that we have towards people who don't even exist yet. So, like, what are our responsibilities towards people who will live 200 years from now, right? Normally, we think of having moral responsibilities to people who are alive and around us. We don't think of having moral responsibilities to people of the future or the past, right? Because they don't exist. But climate change obviously does affect the people who are alive now, but it even more affects the people who will be alive in 100 or 200 years or 500 years. And in fact, there's a lot more of those people than there are people who are alive now. So if our moral responsibility to them is just like our moral responsibility to people who are alive now, then you might think actually we should be even willing to like massively curtail our own welfare in order to protect these people from disastrous consequences that will come down the line, right? So that's a way of thinking about it that probably only a philosopher would come up with. And philosophers can see problems with that way of thinking. So, for example, if we do this instead of that, then it will change everything. And so different people will be born, right? So we're talking about like the responsibility we bear towards different possible groups of future people which again is something that only a philosopher would bother to think about. And I think that can all be useful and it can kind of feed into the debate about climate change. But I don't think that's really where the main action is. The main action is, well, we have a huge problem here. It's obvious that what the problem is and what's causing it. The difficulty is what can be done about it, practically speaking, politically speaking. And I think there's a limit to what philosophers can say about that.
Right, right. So in the next 10 years' time, the way the world is moving forward in a very sort of speedy, in a fast-paced, what should be the focus of philosophy for the next 1 decade? First.
Oh, wow. Well, I mean, one thing that maybe isn't so obvious from the outside is that philosophy is internally extremely diverse. And we've already talked about a whole bunch of different areas of philosophy. So we talked about like philosophy of mind and how it relates to brain science, political philosophy. In a way, we were just talking about metaphysics, like the problem of future individuals and what it means for them to exist. Or you might think of that as a more problem in moral philosophy. What are your moral responsibilities to people who don't exist yet? I mean, my own area is history of philosophy. So I think I'm probably more qualified to say what should happen in the next years in history of philosophy. And there, I think it's very clear that we're living through a phase in philosophy where interest is growing massively in these non-European traditions. So I think that the big difference, so if you kind of fast forwarded, let's say 30 years from now, and you looked at how history of philosophy is taught in, let's say, Europe and North America, I think because those are I'm just saying that because those are the academic worlds that I know best. I think in those environments, 30 years from now, you'll see much, much more teaching of, say, Chinese philosophy, Indian philosophy, African philosophy, Latin American philosophy. I think those will all be, if not things that you can always study, things that you can study much more easily. So it will be in a way more like philosophy is in, let's say, China now. Because in China now you can study Chinese philosophy and you can study European philosophy, right? So they have a kind of global, or I mean, it's not global because they don't do like Latin American philosophy very much in China, as far as I know. But they at least are covering more than one global tradition. Whereas in Europe, that hasn't been done very much, but it's happening more and more. And I think students will also continue to demand it. So I think that's where history of philosophy is going now and will be going over the next decades.
That's really a great news, Peter, because that also opens up for some other cultures and philosophies to get accommodated. So in that process, I would also like to request that perhaps one day you'll also, bring in some of the Nepali philosophers in your podcast to sort of explore what Nepali philosophy is all about. I'll request you to pursue that if there's a possibility sometimes in the future, perhaps. But I'm really thankful, Peter, for your time. Honestly, it has been an honor to talk with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me and have a great day.